Hey there folks, Tim Slade here, and welcome back to the ATD Ask a Trainer video series. In today's episode, my special guest Amy Morrisey and I are answering your questions about localizing training content. So stay tuned. You know, whether you call yourself an instructional designer, an e-learning designer, or just a learning professional, one of the most important lessons to be learned when creating training content is to know your audience. And this doesn't just mean knowing your audience in terms of their skills or what their job looks like. It also means knowing your audience from a language standpoint, a cultural standpoint, and a whole bunch of other things. And this is where localizing your training content comes into play. And that's exactly why I decided to invite Amy to help me tackle your questions about all things localization. So let's get to it. Hey, Amy, thank you so much for joining us for this month's ATD Ask a Trainer episode. So for those who don't know you, we used to work together years ago at Artisan. But for those who don't know you, can you take a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us all what you do for a living.
Yes, I would be happy to. And I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm still at Artisan e-learning all these years later.
Yep.
My day-to-day job is the president of the company, so I run day-to-day operations. But I've been in the learning development well before e-learning. So I have lots of instructional design, lots of instructor-led training in my background. But now, day in, day out, I run an e-learning company.
Yeah, very good. Well, you know, I when I was planning this episode on localizing content, your name came to my head first out of everybody, because when I was at Artisan, I remember some of the most challenging projects we worked on involved localizing content, translating content, and those are always fun projects. And so I'm so happy to have you to share, you know, your years of expertise in localizing content. So before we start tackling some of the questions we have, I think it's important that we define what localization is. And I think sometimes people just think it's translation. I've fallen into that rut sometimes, thinking it's just about the language, but it means a lot more than just translating words. Can you just give a quick definition for everybody on what it means to localize content?
Yeah. So, I mean, very simply, the way I think about it is translation is about words. It's about sometimes audio narration being spoken in a different language. Localization is more about that course being accepted in different cultures. So whether that's across all cultures, or whether that is maybe I am a global company and I have offices in, you know, Germany, Taiwan, and Brazil. Well, localizing would be making that course look and feel like it could be in Germany, whatever all the places I just said, Germany, Taiwan, and Brazil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of how I think about localization.
Yeah, it's everything. It's images, examples given, all of that stuff is incorporated into localization.
You got it.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, good. Are you ready to tackle some questions with me?
I am. Let's go.
All right. Cool. Yeah. All right. So our first question comes from Karthik Richard, and Karthik wants to know, what considerations do you need to account for when localizing content for different cultures? I'll let you kick this one off, Amy. I have some thoughts on this, but I'm curious to know what you think.
Yeah. So I think it's a great question, first of all. So how do we adapt our courses for people in other cultures? First, I'm going to let's dig into that little word culture, because culture can mean lots of things. And so I mentioned a global organization earlier. Well, if I work for a global organization, the organization itself has a culture. And so that has to be, you know, important in that whole process. But here's my big thing. People want to recognize themselves in training. So if I'm taking a course, no matter who I am, where I live, what I do, I want to recognize myself. And if I do, I am much more likely to take action in whatever it is I'm learning about. So what are all the places we talk about this? Translation is one, localization, diversity, equity, and inclusion would be included in something like this across the globe. Accessibility would be included in my definition of that. So I always have a story that I tell around Artisan about my dogs. So I have 2 dogs, and if I'm out with them and I'm responsible for them, they don't run away. If all of us,
Yep.
my husband and my 2 kids and I go outside and we hang out with our dogs, they run away every time. Why?
Mm.
Because nobody feels accountable, right? So if nobody
Right.
feels
Yep.
accountable, then off they go. The same thing happens in learning. If I don't recognize myself, I don't feel accountable. If I don't see myself, I don't feel accountable. So all of those cultures become really important. And I think, going back to the original question, corporate culture often will guide your culture across other countries. What does that look like within the organization?
Sure.
That's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, I totally agree with it. I like it really simplifies it, just saying, can your end user or your learner see themselves in the training? And to your point, that means a lot of different things. One of the examples I think of, in a previous job, we were creating an e-learning course where we had an example of, it was for a scenario where this call center agent was interacting with a small business owner. And the example that was used in the training is the small business owner owned a car dealership, and that was the example we used, and we were translating it for I don't know if it was audience in Manila. I can't remember where it was, but it became really apparent really quickly that example just didn't translate because they weren't interacting with customers who were used car salesmen or dealership owners. And so it's even examples like that, just the smallest thing of like what sort of examples or analogies or metaphors you use in the training cannot translate.
And that's the question
and
you
so
have to ask is, how do we see ourselves in training? So scenarios are a
Right.
great way we see. Images are how we see ourselves. Connection to values, how we see ourselves. So that's it. Like the end user, how do I see myself and can I recognize myself? That's a great
absolutely.
example.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Karthik, and hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Karthik.
Okay, so our next question comes from Kara North. Kara wants to know, how can instructional designers better design learning experiences that can be localized in the future? I love this question because I think, I know, Amy, you're probably going to think about this from an instructional design standpoint. I'm thinking of it more of a technical standpoint, but we have a technical question coming up, so I'm going to hold off some of my technical thoughts. So, Amy, what do you think about that? How can we better design content for future localization?
Yeah, Tim just outed me that instructional design is my jam. So yes, I think you can handle a lot of those technical questions. First of all, Kara, I think the smartest thing is that you're thinking about it ahead of time. So it is always one of my first questions. Could this be translated in the future? And a lot of times people don't know the answer, whether that's another company or an internal stakeholder, they don't know. But we can prepare even if it's a possibility. Second question I always ask is, what possible languages might we be going to, or what possible cultures might we be dealing with? So you're right, Tim. I think it's an instructional design problem just as much as it is a technical problem or a graphics problem. And it's for some of the reasons I've already mentioned. How do we build those scenarios? How do we create something where lots of people can recognize themselves? Tactically, things like avoiding colloquial language, narration, short and sweet. Even just saying short and sweet, that shouldn't show up in a localized or a translated course because not everybody will understand that. So those are some things, some of the things I think about. And then if you know where you're going, think about if you can localize your English version before you go into like full translation and localization, particularly if you're that global company, because the folks who speak English need to understand and see those other cultures anyway. So it doesn't have to be siloed. So that's my thought.
Yeah, it's really a mindset shift. I remember in a previous job, we were a US based company, and then all of a sudden overnight, this company I worked at, we expanded globally, and it forced us to change our mindset completely. That every time, every instructional design decision or technical decision or training decision we made we had to ask ourselves, is this scalable to a global audience? And that involved not only rethinking how we design the content instructionally, but also how we built it technically. And so I think it's more so a mindset shift of being aware that, maybe that content will be translated or localized in the future, and how do you prepare for that, right?
Yeah. And another thing I would say, when you said that, Tim, it made me think of a course that we did many years ago, and we
Mm-hmm.
didn't ask enough questions. We didn't go deep enough in
Mm.
our, I don't know, early online draft where the client was first seeing images. They came back to us, and it was for an Asian country, and they said, we need people who look like they're from Southeast Asia.
Oh,
And like that didn't mean anything to us. And so we hadn't learned
right. Yep.
enough about where we were localizing to, and cost us some money at the back end because we had to fix it.
Yep.
So,
Yep. I remember I worked on a project a few years ago. Because one of the challenges with localization is you just don't know what you don't know, right? And that's okay, right? I mean, of course, it means asking the right questions and partnering the right people
yeah.
to get aware of what you need to know from a localization standpoint. But I was working on this one project, and we had these images, these illustrated characters, and one particular character happened to be wearing a green hat. And it's inappropriate for me to share now. I'll have to tell you this offline, and anybody who's curious, you can message me. But there was some very, very cultural significance to this character and why they were wearing a green hat that just, it would have never crossed my mind. And it was something that if we wouldn't have caught, it would have been incredibly embarrassing. So it's everything, even the clothes or the way you represent characters. Any of those things can have, implications from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah.
And so you're right. It's asking a ton of questions and digging deep.
And making sure those are genuine. I mean, the green hat, whatever that
right.
story is, it's about the genuineness of it. And unfortunately, so many of our stock photography that we, go out into the world and use is a whole bunch of like smiling, happy people. And, let's put this person in a hijab, and let's put that person in a wheelchair, and that's enough. Well, that's not enough. We don't recognize ourselves when it's not a cultural, this is who I am and what I'm about kind of a thing. So,
Yep. I totally agree with that.
that.
Good. Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Kara. Hopefully that answers your question. I'll tell you about that offline, Amy. All right. So our next question comes from Annalisa Giovannini. Hey, Annalisa. Annalisa wants to know, what are some of the technical considerations for localizing training content? So this is similar to Kara's question, but on a technical side. So I'll kick this one off, and then Amy, I'm curious to know what you think. So, I'll look at this mainly from an e-learning standpoint, because that's my background, and that's usually where you run into technical issues with localization. For me, I think the biggest thing, it comes down to the words you use on the screen. For example, I remember once I translated a course. We were localizing a course for the German market, or our learners in Germany, and their words are much bigger than our words, right? And so we had to design and account for the fact that we needed to make sure that we were designing our on-screen text to ensure it fit once it was translated. You also run into issues sometimes with the types of fonts you use. Not all fonts have the same characters that other languages use. And so you need to use like a Unicode font that allows for different use of characters. The other thing that I think about too is, when you're translating something like an e-learning course, for anyone who's ever done that, you kind of have two options. Do you translate inside the course, meaning you have a screen that lets the learner select their language and then they branch to that, or do you create multiple courses for the multiple language? And what sort of technical implications does that have? What sort of LMS implications does that have, right? Is the LMS also localized and translated? And if not, could that cause a learning experience issue? And so I view it's primarily related to translation, but I'm sure there's other ones. So I don't know. What do you think about that, Amy?
Yeah, I think all of those. We have clients where we are translating into 13 languages, and, can we have that all housed in one storyline file? I mean, you just made the world hard, maybe harder than it needs to be. But why do they have to have it that way? I mean, that's always a big question for us.
Sure.
I love the example of the German words. Many times people will forego quality assurance checks on translation because it's the same content. And so there's the quality assurance that is having a native speaker, take the course and understand it and all of that. But there's also the quality assurance of did the did the font fall out of the box? We have to put that in there. So I think testing. Another one, we actually now have one of our development managers specializes in translation because we do a good amount of work. And one of her pet peeves is embedded text in images. So now we've embedded a text and an image in English, and now we're dealing with Photoshop or whatever to get it out when we don't have to do that. We could be smart about it in the first place. Yeah. I think too, this isn't not exactly technical, but technical in the writing side of things. I said earlier, make it short and sweet, and we shouldn't say those things. Think about all the jargon in your industry, and then just jargon we use. One that I think of a lot is we use this expression a lot of times now where we say, I'm in the space, like we're in the e-learning space. What does that mean? Imagine it. Think of it. Visualize. What does I'm in the e-learning space look like, sound like? Is it understandable outside of North America, maybe?
Yeah, I totally agree. And the other thing, this isn't technical again, but it comes to mind, is I think it's also important, not just from a translation standpoint, but from a localization standpoint, is just don't assume anything. Right. Go ask and get the right answer. I remember when I used to have an employee that worked for me who was in Germany, and I went to go onboard this person. I spent 2 weeks in Munich, and I remember one morning I went to go get a pretzel because you go down the subway and there's these amazing bakeries, and I grabbed a pretzel, and I was eating it, and I was talking to this coworker, this employee of mine, and I made a joke about how, here in the United States, we love our pretzels with, like fake cheese, but I couldn't find any fake cheese. And of course, and I made a comment. I was like, oh, but I couldn't find any spicy mustard either. And she looked at me so weird. And I'm like, yeah, the traditional way you eat a pretzel, right? With spicy mustard. And she's like, no. We don't eat pretzels with spicy mustard. It's a breakfast pastry that they eat with butter, And so even what we think sometimes is the correct cultural way of doing something, it's oftentimes not, right? Yeah. And so you never want to assume. You always want to go get the actual answer, right? It'll surprise you more often than not.
I so 100% agree with
you. Good. Oh, did you have something else?
I want to add one little quickie. A Google search is often not enough. Yeah. So a Google search in trying to figure out it's not enough. Right. It's not enough. Like you got to go find the right people. We were doing a program on microfinancing in sub-Saharan Africa. So go Google African Bank. It's a brand name.
Yeah.
So I can't just go Google it. And then if I say, okay, well, banks in Africa, some of them are high rises that look like New York City. Some of them are almost like lean-tos on the side of the road. So like Google's not enough.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Good. Well, thank you so much, Annalisa. All right. So our next question comes from, and I apologize ahead of time if I'm going to butcher your name, but I'll give it a good shot. Hariono Jijono. I think there's some silent letters in that name. So hopefully I was silent with the right ones. So Hariono wants to know, what are some learning principles that hold steady across cultures, and how do you validate that? I'll let you take this one, Amy, because I'm sure you have a great answer about it.
Yeah. Well, the thing I want to say right up front is that I have never been a researcher or a validator. That's not what my expertise is in. So just straight up, this is opinion. My belief is that as instructional designers, we should be students of human behavior, because that's what we're trying to change. We're trying to influence. We want people to do something differently as a result of being trained. So prior to Artisan, I worked with the Ecliptic Consulting Group. It's a great little consulting firm. And Mike Riga is the owner of it, and he gave me permission to talk about this. We taught in human behavior that there are basically 3 things that people use to influence or persuade. The first one is coercion. So it's like the big stick. I'm the big company. I have the big stick. You're going to do it because I said so. And, sometimes that works, but it doesn't last, and it's probably doesn't have a lot of place in our training. Mm-hmm. Normative process does have some place in training and development. The nasty way of saying it is peer pressure, but other people are doing this. And so therefore we might want to learn about that. There's some place for that. But the number one thing that gets human beings, no matter where they live on this planet, to change behavior is to tap into their self-interest. So it kind of goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this. If people can recognize themselves and we can tap into how they would make that change of their own accord, without me pushing on them, how would they do it? And if I can make that connection for them, they're so much more likely to change behavior. So it's not validated. It's not, we can take this into this culture or this culture or this culture from an e-learning or a training and development standpoint, but it's absolutely validated from a human behavior standpoint. That's how I think of it.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. So it's just tapping into what's the motivation that learner, that's going to motivate that learner to actually make a change, right? Yeah. I totally agree with that. Good. Well, I'll leave that one there. I don't have anything to add. I think that totally makes sense.
Okay.
So thank you, Hariono. And again, I apologize if I got your name incorrect. Okay, so our final question comes from Dallas Jensen. Hey, Dallas. And Dallas wants to know, what are some of the unforeseen costs of using outside vendors or freelancers for localizing training content? This is an important one because if you pick the wrong vendor, pick the wrong freelancer, it can be really costly having to do a lot of rework. But I'm curious, Amy, at Artisan, you guys work with a lot of different contractors or vendors when you're working on content. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think vetting that vendor is huge. I mean, we kind of have a vendor of choice because we've stepped in it a few times. So a couple of things that have gotten us and cost us along the way. Recently, we were doing a course and we translated into French. And when our client heard the French accent, it didn't translate to the kind of French accent they wanted. They wanted a South African French accent. And so there's the cost that's on us that we didn't figure that out ahead of time, but the South African French accent was much more difficult for them to find and get, and therefore it cost us more. So we were not prepared for that. Character audio, we now know to prepare for, but we learned the hard way that many vendors, every single new audio talent has an initial fee. So whether that person is your narrator for a 3-hour course or they're doing 30 seconds of character audio, you pay that fee. So we often will rewrite a little bit for translation or just are cautious about character audio. And then just generally my other biggie, there are lots, but not having a second set of eyes internally or at the client for us in a particular language has gotten us in trouble along the way. So making sure that you're validating what that vendor is doing, even if you trust them.
Yeah. I think what you're bringing up, and this goes back to something I should have mentioned with Hariono's question, is the importance of user acceptance testing. I remember once I was translating a course, and we hired a vendor to do the translation. And then what we did is I recommend this for anybody doing translations, is go and have it validated by somebody who speaks that native language, right? And come to find out, whatever they translated it into was not that language. It was something else. And we suspect they used Google Translate to do the translation. And so we had to have that done over again, and that was very costly. I think the other thing you have to think about is, if, let's say, for example, I'll use translation as the example. If you're translating a course that you're developing in English and then you're going to translate into other languages, when do you actually perform the translation? If you do it too early and then you have edits, you might have to redo all that work in all of those other translated or localized courses, right? And so there's also that consideration about how much rework you might be doing when you're essentially creating multiple versions of a training object.
I'm so glad you said that. That's almost just so standard for me. I didn't even think about it as the answer, but we don't touch a translation until we've gotten sign off on the English version, right, to the very best of our ability. Yeah. Which I think goes to those added costs. You've also got the opportunity costs of when the timeline goes astray because you've made these mistakes, and you can't forget those when you're planning out projects like this. So if we don't think about it ahead of time and it extends the timeline, what else could we be working on, when we're having to go back and fix this thing? So.
Yeah. Good. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that question, Dallas. All right. Well, Amy, it was great having you, and you brought so much great insight to this month's episode. So, where can people find you online if they want to connect with you, work with you, or just reach out if they have questions?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And thanks for having me. This was super fun. I
Yeah.
always like to hang out with you, Tim.
Thank you.
We are at artisanelearning.com. That's our website. And you can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn. My name's Amy Morrisey, and you can find me through any of those means as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a great day.
All right, I think that's all we have time for today. Of course, I want to thank Amy for joining me to help me tackle those awesome questions. And as always, a big thanks to everyone who submitted a question for this month's episode. If you happen to be watching this on YouTube and you want to get alerted when we publish our next episode of ATD Ask a Trainer, make sure to click that subscribe button below. And also make sure to check out the ATD Ask a Trainer advice column by clicking on the link in the description. My name is Tim Slade, and until next time, I'll see you around.